Recently, I started my Devil May Cry journey and just got done finishing the first game, which was a hard but enjoyable experience. But ever since I completed that, all I've heard was, "Oh man, you better get ready, DMC2 sucks," or "Man, you really gonna play DMC2?" But I'm not the type of guy to skip a game, so I had to try it. Going into it, my expectations were low, considering how much slander I've heard about the game, but even still, I didn't know what to expect. Understanding the reputation this game has, I went into this thinking that the gameplay was going to be drastically different, but instead, it was more of the same. However, there is one key aspect that's different in this game compared to DMC1, and that's the ability to play as Lucia. Since this game has two playable characters that you need to use to finish the game, let's talk about each character and their own gameplay separately, since there's subtle differences between the two. Starting off with the obvious, you can play as Dante. His movement is about the same as the first, with him doing this medium paced jog as you run from place to place, but it's still a head scratcher as to why there isn't a direct sprint button, because that would make everything even faster, but it's really no big deal. The jumping is about the same as well, with him being able to double jump and jump off of obstacles onto other platforms. His actual combat is slower than it was before, but he's still able to perform a set of combos if you mash the attack button. One thing I didn't utilize for not only Dante but Lucia was the aerial attacks, as there wasn't a lot of situations where I had to juggle enemies mid-air to inflict damage. If you're familiar with DMC, then you already know about the array of weapons Dante has, and this game is no different. I'd have to say between the pistols, machine guns, shotguns, and rocket launcher, I still enjoy the shotguns the most. To me, it seems like they had the best balance of firepower and reload speed, making them a must for most encounters. A close second would be the rocket launcher, as the damage output was high on those as well. Now regarding his swords, I thought they didn't make a huge difference in the gameplay. The changes between each sword may help in the combat, but it really depends on the enemies you're facing as to which sword you prefer the most. If there was one I leaned on, it would be the one that's a bit slower but does more damage. I forget the name, but it just does a couple of slashes that lower a significant amount of HP depending on the enemy. As far as his devil abilities, they function just as they did before, with you having different elements that you could use which would enhance your attacks. What I thought this game did a good job of was forcing you to use all the abilities, because the same one doesn't work on every single enemy. Now I could be wrong, but in the first game when you activated the devil trigger, you would regain health only when damage was dealt. But in this game, you have the option to equip an ability that emphasizes health regeneration while in devil form, which I thought was a really good addition. If this was in the first game and I forgot, let me know in the comments. Let's switch gears to Lucia. Lucia's gameplay is similar to Dante's, but there's enough of a difference for one to have a preference between the two. As a sword, she has what looks like a pair of cutlasses called cutlassier, which are decent weapons, but not memorable in the slightest. Performing her physical attacks are slower than you would like, but still serve a purpose, but overall I think she's best used from afar. In my opinion, attacking from a distance with Lucia is definitely the best approach to almost every combat situation, regardless of the enemy type. She has access to a handful of throwable weapons, all useful depending on the situation, but by far the most useful are throwing knives. Lucia throws these fast, and it doesn't take long at all for the animation to sort of recharge and allow her to throw them again. Once you collect enough red orbs, you can upgrade the damage on these, making them even more effective. If you only played the first game, you may be thinking, well, that's cool, but what's the big deal? The reason why these knives are so important is because the boss fights are no longer in tight spaces. In the first game, most of these fights were in small corridors where it was beneficial to use physical attacks, whereas these encounters are in bigger, more open spaces, giving you the ability to jump around and attack from different angles with ease. You can probably see where I'm going with this. If you keep your distance, you can just spam the throwing knives until the enemy's health dwindles all the way down to zero. Depending on the enemy, this can be a bit time consuming, but most of the time, this strategy works on almost every fight for Lucia, at least on normal. Just like Dante, she has the ability to use devil powers which help out in combat. I would say there isn't anything crazy in regards to the differences between her powers and his, but it's worth noting that how you use her powers combined with the weapons is going to be different than how you will with Dante. For some reason, I used the regenerative ability more with Lucia than I did Dante. Probably because her physical attacks don't deal as much damage, even when upgraded, but that's just me. Both Dante and Lucia's gameplay is fun and addicting, as facing waves upon waves of demons never really gets old. Even though the speed isn't as fast as I would like, The movement is still good, making it easy to perform various combos and attacks. But one thing that hindered both of their gameplay is an issue that was present from the first game: the camera. If you played the first, then you know that the camera was absolutely terrible. It was a pain to move from place to place, as it would change angles at the most inconvenient times and make the combat way harder than it should have been. Unfortunately, it's not much better in the sequel. Right from the beginning, you can tell the camera is about the same, as you see Dante from a third-person perspective, but as soon as he starts to get out of frame or is too far out in the distance, the camera would shift, which on the surface it makes sense. But where the camera really starts to get annoying is during the combat. Most of the time you're on the ground when fighting enemies, but this game features a lot of demons that can fly. However, when those same enemies approach you, they never fly low enough for you to see. At first, it may seem like it's not that serious, but when you have a handful of demon birds that are at the top of the screen, and you can't view where they are so you can hit them, it gets frustrating pretty fast. What makes it even worse is that you can't move the analog stick up to manually move the camera. The camera stays at the same height no matter what. In order to kill these aerial enemies, your best bet was using range attacks in the air or from the ground to inflict damage. This inability to change the camera height not only affects the combat, but the platforming as well. It still changes angles, which is to be expected, but when you need to jump up, trying to judge where you're falling can be tricky at times. If you could move the camera up above your character to see where you would line up when you jump, the platforming sections will go a lot smoother. Some of these critiques regarding the camera may seem minute to the casual player, or be seen as a skill issue, but once you get your hands on the game, you'll see how much it hinders the gameplay. Another critique that I gotta bring up is the targeting system. During combat, a purple reticle will appear over top of the enemy that you're attacking, serving as some sort of lock-on. However, when faced with multiple enemies, there isn't a way to manually switch the lock-on. Instead, it goes away and then returns as you get closer to each demon. Again, it's not game-breaking, but what happens is that you'll end up striking enemies that you don't want to, simply because the reticle moves on its own. There isn't a setting to change it either, forcing you to adapt and get used to the automatic targeting. Now, I understand that this game is dated, as it released during the PS2 generation, but manual or automatic lock was a thing back then for sure. I can't imagine why that wasn't included in this game. Regardless, once you learn how the reticle moves, it gets easier to deal with. The last thing I wanted to mention is that the boss fights are not nearly as annoying in this game as they were in the first. As I mentioned earlier, they don't take place in super small corridors, and the difficulty has been turned down a couple notches. What I thought was cool was the color health bars, as the enemies had different color HP bars as you progressed further in the game. As soon as I saw those, it reminded me of the bosses from Kingdom Hearts 1, which used the same color coding system for the boss fights. The actual fights themselves aren't hard at all, and as long as you stock up on items, you should be able to breeze through almost every fight. To my surprise, they brought back the one enemy I thought I would never see again: the giant spider.
Finally! I was getting tired of playing your childish games.
If you don't know, this spider is one of the first bosses you face in the first, and gave me all sorts of trouble, so to see it again made my skin crawl. Fortunately, the devs kept its attack patterns the same, and coupled with the added space, the fight was a cakewalk. Hopefully that is the last time I see that ugly spider as I move throughout the rest of the series. To put it simply, this game is just as fun as the first because it's essentially the same. Outside of playing with two characters, everything feels familiar, like I picked up right from before. If the camera issue was fixed and the movement was faster, then the whole gameplay loop would have flowed better. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, Trish is a playable character if you beat the game in hard mode, but I finished my normal run with both characters and dipped. I hear that there's some differences with her gameplay, and I wish they would have let her be playable from the jump, but I'll do another run one day to get the opportunity to try her out. If there was one area where the game really lacked, it was the story. It takes place on Vie de Marley Island, where Dante has to help stop a businessman from raising a demon and obtaining supreme power. If you played the first, you may be a little confused because that's not where we left off at the end. On top of that, I found myself looking around like, where's Trish? We went through so much to save her in the first game that I thought for sure she'd be in the second, but she's nowhere to be seen. Once again, the story is told slowly through missions with cutscenes playing at the start and end of each mission as you complete them. The cutscenes themselves look better visually, but I'd be lying if I said I really cared about this story much at all. Even at the start, the whole vibe felt off, like it was lacking that DMC flair. Yes, it had demons, but it was just missing something. The best way to describe this plot is like a side story, as if Dante got called away to complete a job before returning back to the shop. It's hard to get invested in Lucia and the other characters when they did such a good job at building up Dante, Mundus, and Trish in the first game, making my interest in this story dwindle as I got deeper in. Oh yeah, and the villain is completely forgettable. I can't even remember his name. Axel? Orin? Arius, that's his name. Man, this guy was a pushover, and I didn't give a flying about this character in the slightest. In my opinion, this guy was missing the most important quality a villain needs to have, and that's the threat of danger. Not for a single second did I think this guy really posed a threat. He just seemed like some kook who got his hands on some demon powers and we had to put this man down. In the end, the story is the aspect of the game I dislike the most, and if that's where the majority of the slander comes from, then I completely understand. A good thing is that the cutscenes are completely skippable, so if you want to replay the game, you don't have to go through everything all over again. Real quick, I wanted to discuss the atmosphere of the game. The entire game takes place on a deserted island, and it definitely felt deserted. The whole time we didn't see any mind-bending effects or rituals or things that were present in the first. Sure, there's traps and statues in different rooms, but the whole trippiness from before was gone. One thing I liked about the first was how everything felt magical yet creepy at the same time. Even grabbing orbs and gaining demon powers didn't have the same pop or flair that it did before. I know I only played the first, but when I think of DMC, I think of over the top, grand, and flashy, and this game was the complete opposite of that. I don't know if that's the entire point, was for the game to be dreary and gloomy, but it didn't hit at all. I like the risk that they took with the location, because fighting on a demon-infested island is pretty cool, but everything inside wasn't executed the best. Hopefully in the next game we get back to how DMC normally is. Overall, I think Devil May Cry 2 was vastly overhated and not nearly as bad as I've heard and seen on the internet. Yes, there's issues with the game that hold it back from being as good as it could have been, but that's just it. The issues are fixable, at least in the gameplay department. The story? Yeah, that entire thing should have been scrapped and rewritten right from the start. But as a complete package, the game isn't bad, but it doesn't have that DMC feel and look that was present in the first. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 7.5. I enjoyed my time with the game, but most of what I liked came from the gameplay and not the story. The atmosphere was different from the first, and the story gives many players a good reason to not ever return to this game. However, if you're someone like myself who enjoys the gameplay of this, then it's definitely worth running through this game a couple more times, especially to play as Trish. If this was the worst game in the entire franchise, then I can't wait to play the rest of the DMC games, because I'm sure those are going to be miles ahead of what this game was. I'm excited to play DMC 3 and see how much better that game is compared to this title. What did you think about Devil May Cry 2? Do you think this game is bad? Did you even play it? Or did you go right to 3? Let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed the video, feel free to drop a like or subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.
What? The ritual was incomplete. But the door to the demon world is... Wait. What are you doing?
My job is hunting devils.
Once you enter the demon world, you may never be able to return. I'll go. I'm expendable.